What we're going to talk about in this session is to start off with really nothing to do with SSL in particular, but more about the fundamentals of information security, which underpin why this is such an important area for SharePoint and similar products going forward in with the changes effectively that have been driven by Microsoft's investment in cloud. But these things are old. They've always been like this. So as long as there's been an information security practice, these principles underpin anything that we do to mitigate risk. So it's very important that when we are planning the implementation of our web applications in SharePoint, but also our service interaction or our hybrid deployment, we make those decisions based on sound fundamentals, not just because there's some web page out there on TechNet that says in order to configure this connection between two environments, you must use this type of certificate. Because just by using a certificate isn't necessarily mitigating any risk, and that's what we're all about here. We're trying to avoid exposing our systems over time to a variety of different types of threats. Then we'll talk a little bit about SSL. This will be review material for most of you based on the show of hands. Then we'll talk in more detail about how SharePoint makes it so trivially easy to set these guys up and manage them and deal with expiry and all of those kind of things. That's a bit of a joke. Where the points of configuration are in terms of SharePoint on-premises and where the points of configuration are with respect to Office 365 and or hybrid. So when I talk about Office 365, I'm really talking about hybrid deployments. Right? How many of you here have customers that are just using cloud and no on-premises? A couple of you. Yeah, it's pretty rare. Most cases, it's a combination of two different environments. It's a bit like when people move to SharePoint from previous content management systems, the dream is that the old content management system goes away, but the reality is it usually hangs around on its last legs for many years. I'm not sure how much demonstration we'll be able to fit in because this is actually an hour slot, but we'll try and show a few things that might be of interest and then a wrap up at the end. So as I mentioned, the information security fundamentals drive all of the things that we do to mitigate risk in our environments, whether they be SharePoint or SQL Server or Oracle or no matter what. And they're the things that underpin basically the industry that's out there that's selling all manner of crazy things. Firewalls with additional network adapters, SSL accelerators, all of those kind of things are point solutions for problems that a point solution can't solve, okay? So where this comes from originally is a thing called the CIA Triad. Every security threat that we face in information security can be categorized in one of these three broad areas. The first one is confidentiality. It's pretty straightforward, basically meaning that you can be guaranteed that only the people who can see a particular piece of information can see it, nobody else can. So you guarantee or attempt to guarantee the confidentiality of that data. The next one is integrity, which basically means that the information isn't tampered with as it passes through the tiers of a system or over the network. And then availability, the one piece that pretty much everybody kind of in the security industry at least de-emphasizes, right? And the principle here is a system can't be considered secure if it's not available, okay? It might sound a bit strange because you can't really make a system truly secure, certainly not if it's connected to a network, but the principle here is valid. If you think about the Azure outages that happened 18 months ago, okay, that were worldwide outages across all of the Microsoft hosting environment, it was down to availability issue. They basically renewed their certificates, but the script that they'd written to roll out these certificate changes to every web server across all the different farms in the different data centers had a fault in it. So it wasn't that they forgot to renew the SSL certificate or the person who was getting the email from the vendor wasn't there. It was that they hadn't tested that capability enough. Now, obviously, they've learned from that, and it was a pretty serious outage for them. Heads rolled. They've got that fixed, but that's the example of availability being a category of threat, and it's a substantial category of threat financially to the hosting organization. So most threats will be in one of these areas. Now, there's lots of other taxonomies for defining this thing. You've probably heard of a thing called Stride, which is a Microsoft application-specific kind of taxonomy. But they all boil down to these three things in their essence. And from an IT or infrastructure perspective, we're going to be looking at these three areas predominantly. And certainly, as far as SSL is concerned, it's dealing with all of these three things. Most often, it's considered in the area of integrity, but it's you can't have that without confidentiality. And, if the system isn't available, then neither of those two things will work either. And this stuff is ancient. This stuff was put together back nearly 25 years ago, and it still does remain valid, even though things have changed considerably. Other things to bear in mind. Now, before I did SharePoint, I used to be in this industry. I helped build and sell a managed security company. The problem we face with these types of threats is there is no point solution, right? How many of you have worked with SharePoint across a firewall, and you've had an app server in one network and a web server in another, or a SQL server across a firewall? That firewall effectively becomes a router, right? Because there's so many ports and protocols that are going through it that it's no longer doing the job that it was designed to do. And the more complicated something is, the more difficult it is to manage, the more likelihood things go wrong. So it's not really about products. It's not about buying a piece of software that can make things more secure. It's not about doing penetration testing. All of these things have value, but the reality is, if you think of it from an operational perspective, it's the people and the processes that really define whether you have a level of risk management in the environment. There's no silver bullets. Now, the entire security industry wants to sell you silver bullets, whether it be a load balancer, or an SSL accelerator, those kind of things. But it's all adding complexity into the environment. In some cases, you need those devices. But the idea that they're giving you it gives you a full sense of security because you've spent a bunch of money and you've put this thing in that you're now protected against a category of threat. And that's not the case. There's also status quo in the industry. Not this terrible rock band, apologies to any status quo fans in the house, but the general approach in the security industry, right? There's a lot of vendors out there in the market of selling firewalls. It's in their interest to keep selling the idea of the DMZ or multiple networks, because every time you implement something like that, a screen subnet or a DMZ, you're required to purchase additional network interface, okay? So that status quo is the industry basically still selling the same solutions that they were doing 10, 15 years ago. Firewalls, load balancers, all those types of things. But more importantly, the legacy architectures that are out there in terms of network design. If you think about SharePoint, we used to have all these posters on TechNet, what I call marketecture, with these heinously complicated designs for edge firewall and back-to-back screened hookery-dookery network, all that kind of stuff. Those don't exist for SharePoint 2013. That's a good thing because customers took those as implicitly recommended topologies to deploy SharePoint. And indeed, the only one that was recommended is Edge Firewall. That's the only one that makes any sense from a security perspective. The rest of them just look really nice on a Visio. Okay? They don't actually have the advantages and disadvantages that were described on those articles, and that's why those no longer exist. It would also be a lot more complicated when you start thinking about hybrid, adding those types of things into the mix. So we need to be quite cautious of this because there's a lot of people selling, add-ons to SharePoint or things that provide supposed security value to SharePoint. But if the core deployment is weak in terms of risk management, you're not actually getting any benefit from those things. Everything is always a compromise. Unless we're in the lucky position that we're starting from scratch with a brand new estate and we're putting SharePoint into that environment, there's always going to be a compromise in the deployment, whether the customer has already mandated, maybe because of a company security policy, that SharePoint must be in a DMZ. Okay, which means now you've got to deal with inter-server traffic across these different VLANs in that environment. So that's a massive compromise. It doesn't actually provide any security value, but oftentimes the SharePoint person or the SharePoint project is not in a position to be able to modernize companies' security policies. If you work with the UK or US military, you'll be very familiar with this, because most of those policies were indeed written in the late 70s for IT systems that were never envisaged to be anywhere near the internet. But it's also things like working with existing infrastructure. One of my customers last week is trying to do a deployment to the internet, basic SharePoint stuff, nothing complicated, but they want it to work via a riverbed. Well, the riverbed doesn't work with SharePoint 2013 because it doesn't understand the URLs of the product. So when you try and do things like a SharePoint app, it all falls apart. But they've obviously have that existing investment and they want to use it, and that's natural. So there's going to be a compromise there. They're going to have to buy or purchase some other device, probably a web application proxy server, to work around that. So now they've got two devices that do the same thing. Same with enterprise architectures. Large corporations particularly have lots of standards, policies, procedures that define how applications get deployed into an estate. The problem with those things is they're all done largely in theoretical terms without understanding the applications. And they won't, there will be a compromise between what the sort of architecture defines and what's possible to do with the product. Development practices as well as a huge area here. We're all familiar with all of the SharePoint vendors in the marketplace that are selling you solutions. How secure are their development practices? And you can also say the same thing about SharePoint itself, right? How secure are the development practices that Microsoft have used themselves with SharePoint over the years? In certain areas, certainly something like the user profile service, there was no security development lifecycle applied to that. And that's pretty scary if you think about it, because in SharePoint 2013 and in the next SharePoint, and in whatever comes out from after that, the way we manage authorization to application services is based on the user profile. If the user profile isn't there, you can't authenticate users, or authorize users, I should say. So a lot of things to be aware of in this space that will influence the decisions on how to try and mitigate some of these issues, and what purchase or deployment is going to give you any kind of bang for buck. So risk management is really what information security is about. We can't make the risk go away completely. Okay, there's not really any way to do that unless we unplug all the machines from the network. One of my customers about 10 years ago decided they didn't like USB ports on client machines, on desktops. So they had guys go around and fill in the USB ports with glue, basically. And the principle there was that would stop people, stealing a document and sending it onto a newspaper or whatever. Well, it's, there's a counterpoint here, obviously. So we can't make the risk go away. We can only manage it. The most popular type of risk management is to ignore it, right? Just say, yeah, blah, 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 we don't care, right? You're all familiar with Sony, the large company that recently had a bit of an issue with some email. But before that, they had numerous attacks on the PlayStation user database. The first one of those, the reason it happened is because they ignored the risk. They just thought that it's not going to happen, we're not bothered, we're not going to spend the time and money to deal with it, and they got burnt. Quite similar is accepting it. I've done a lot of work in the retail space here in the UK with supermarkets, those kind of people, in the early days of online grocery shopping. And this is an area where the development of the system, the pace of the development of those systems is very rapid. They're making lots of small changes to try and see what works and what doesn't. The things that they don't work, they throw them away. So it's a kind of, it's not an agile development process, but it's a very fast-paced one. And so in that type of situation, if you go and do a security review on those types of developments, you will get a report back with hundreds of things that are wrong with it from a security perspective. But are they going to spend the time and money to mitigate those risks by changing the code, buying a protection device, all those kind of things? Probably not, because they know that the life cycle of the application is so short that it's not worth spending the money. So that's knowing that the risk exists, but basically accepting it and making a value judgment that the likelihood of it being exploited is so low that they can live with it. That's becoming less and less acceptable, no pun intended, on the internet because of things, zero-day vulnerabilities. So it's becoming less and less reasonable to be able to just do this. But for SharePoint, we have to, because lots of the vulnerabilities we're addressing are ones we cannot control. They're ones in SharePoint. Okay? There's 15 cross-site scripting vulnerabilities in SharePoint 2013 RTM. Okay? They exist. You can't really do any great damage with them. You can just do silly things like go and change the web page and so forth. And all of those have now been fixed. Okay, they don't exist in the later builds, but most customers are still running SharePoint 2013 RTM, and they have those vulnerabilities. We can try and remove them in SharePoint. The best way to remove things is to turn services off. Right? If we're not using the Visio shared service application, we just turn that off, right? A lot of customers deploy an auto SP installer type approach with SharePoint 2013 that basically, because the customer's not entirely clear on what pieces of the product they want to use on day one, they deploy everything and see what happens. That's going to increase the attack surface of the deployment significantly. But we are limited there in terms of what we can remove. It's really about, reducing the number of services that are running. That's about as far as we can take it. Mitigating it is where the security industry earns their money, right? This is all about putting something in place, whether it be people, process, or product, and hopefully a combination of all three, which basically protects and reduces the impact of certain vulnerabilities. A good example here is intrusion detection system. So Premier League Football Club, based in the Northwest, we'll leave it at that, because otherwise you'll know who it is. They do this at particular points of the season. They include other external parties in to help them look at their intrusion detection, because they're a huge target for malicious denial of service type breaches during the run-in of the football season. And then getting more and more popular, certainly in Europe, perhaps not so much in America, but certainly here in Europe, is to outsource the risk management to somebody else. In other words, pay somebody, usually a large organization, a lot of money to make it their problem. And if anything goes wrong, you get some money back. So all of the things that we do, including our work with SSL, is basically in this space, in the mitigation space. We also have to think about security trade-offs. We've already spoken about practical compromise when we're working with a deployment. We also have to think about other things here. So, we've got the level of complexity of a system. If you think about a firewall rule base that has 1,500 rules, somebody has to manage that rule base. And with that many rules, it's very easy for one to remain there that shouldn't be, not get updated correctly, etc. So the more complex a system is, inherently the less secure it will be, because there's so much that can go wrong. But we also need to think about supportability. So there's lots of things we can do to harden SharePoint, which will destroy the supportability from Microsoft of the product. Okay, because they can't test all these scenarios that we might come up with. There's no way on earth they'll ever be able to test all of the types of deployments. Again, think about those network diagrams. The reason those don't exist is because to publish them, Microsoft has to invest time and resources to build them out, test them with every feature of SharePoint, whether it be user profiles, team sites, Visio, work management. The increasing sort of features of SharePoint is not slowing down, right? We're just getting more and more stuff, and so the testing burden is enormous. But also usability. Oh, there you go, that's nice. That's not very usable. You've all seen these things, right? I hate these things, these capture things, right? That supposedly preventing, a site getting pummeled with people posting rubbish, or it's trying to identify that you're a human. Well, what happens when it goes wrong and the image can't be generated? Right? And in this case, if you type in, "we're sorry, but no image is available," it doesn't work, right? I mean, this is trashed. So at this point, for this particular validation, which is, I think, from Flickr, it doesn't work. Right? So you've just destroyed the usability of the system. Also, if you use online banking, you'll be familiar with those things that you stick your debit card in, you type in a number. Well, that probably works great for all of us, but how well does it work for your grandmother? Right? It's not happening. Those things are a disaster from usability. We're supposed to actually be making these things easier, not making them more difficult, but the industry hasn't got it together yet. Another example is, with Windows clients now, you can log on using a Microsoft account, right? What used to be a Live ID. That's kind of cool. You do that, and then you can hook up to your email or to your Flickr or to your Facebook, and you never have to remember that password. Great idea, but what's the reality of that? It works quite well for Windows, but everywhere else, we're still all working with multiple usernames and passwords for every service we use, right? More and more of them, we can't remember what the password is because at one point we did this trust validation exercise, and it was 2 years ago when we set the original password. That whole area is just ripe for attack. And you all see the things that come up in the news media, in the IT media, when such and such a service has lost its database. We all know what those passwords are, right? The wife's name, most of them are, password 123 or whatever. I mean, that's what they are. Because the password itself is just rubbish. It's a terrible way of securing things, and it's a terrible compromise or trade-off in these areas. So Da Vinci said that simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. And we're a long way from that because most of the work that we deal with in terms of SharePoint, any kind of web-based systems, hybrid, cloud, even something like OneDrive, the consumer OneDrive, is extremely complex. And our weakest link is basically the authorization process. So that brings us to SSL because we're basically using SSL as a mechanism to mitigate the risk of the authorization processes involved in the features and services of the product we're using, in this case, SharePoint. So you'll all know this based on the show of hands earlier, but quite briefly, all this is a high-level protocol that runs basically below things like HTTP to provide a solution for confidentiality and integrity. The HTTP specification, the RFC, basically said that security was not considered in the design of this protocol. Okay? Interesting, isn't it, that today, and for the foreseeable future, everything we use is based on HTTP, which was designed for an entirely different set of circumstances to what we now use it for. We see advances, supposedly, in application development, products that are available. Cloud apparently is new. All of these things are underpinned by HTTP. And basically all it does is it allows us to have a secure server-to-server or server-to-client connection and allow for authentication over a secure channel. It also allows two machines or two principals in reality to have an encrypted channel for communications. Now SharePoint uses this whether we choose to or not when we install it. And it puts in that self-gen certificate at the point of farm creation or when we join a machine to a farm. But the rest of it's all open by default. So why is this important? Well, in the cloud, or on the internet, as I like to call it, everything flows over a thing called the Universal Firewall Bypass Protocol. Okay? Why is SSL so popular? Because it allows you to do that encrypted channel without having to get some dude to open up 15 ports on a firewall. Okay? Everything we do uses this. Another area to consider is if we'd done this talk 10 years ago, there would be nobody in the room. Right? Dead cert guarantee. In my previous life as an information security consultant, we were often asked to review somebody's internal system and do a penetration test and all that type of stuff, application security reviews. And we would do that, and we would come back with a report recommending you do X, Y, and Z to help mitigate the risks. We'd also categorize, how big of a risk something was and all those kind of things. But you'd always get this back. It's like, oh no, it's on our internal network, we're secure. Well, the reality is most organizations' so-called internal network are actually less secure than the public internet. That never used to be the case when there was an edge of the network. But today there is no edge of the network. We've all got a mobile phone with our email on it, right? So there is no network edge. Is there any antivirus software running on an iPhone? No. But you're still opening those document attachments and working with them, perhaps on an iPad with the Office client that they have there now. So the network edge doesn't exist. There's obviously other things that impact in terms of cost. This is something you have to buy. You have to have somebody that knows how to configure it. You need to have somebody that's still going to be there when the renewal comes up and you get the reminder email from VeriSign or whatever. If that's gone to some dude that has left or been fired, that can be a problem. There is a large Australian bank that basically let the root CA or the root certificate of its corporate CA to expire. And somebody in America, smart, saw that, brought it, and held that company to ransom for quite a lot of money, basically, to give them their root certificate back. So doesn't matter how sort of laughable you think that might be, it happens, right? And it's a failure in the people and process. Those small things have a big impact. And of course, SharePoint is perfect, right? We've got this lovely screen in Central Admin that says the SSL setup wizard, right? And it does all the work for us. I mean, SharePoint is completely ignorant of SSL. Okay, when we create a web application, it does everything it possibly can to persuade us to configure the web application in the wrong way. Okay? That's just because it's old, right? When we create a web application, it's effectively the same code running today as was running in SharePoint 2003, which was written in 2001. It's why we need the IIS6 compatibility as a prereq on the machine before we can install SharePoint. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's crazy. Why don't they fix it? Well, it's not actually broken, right? It works. It's just everybody has to understand what's wrong about it and use the tricks to get what we need. And SSL is one of the areas of IIS that it just doesn't manage for reasons of legacy. So it's a bit more difficult than it should be. Now, back to why SSL is important. Here's some examples. This is a Google image search of Newcastle. Okay, I've just gone to Google, hit a Newcastle in, and it's SSL. Maybe you can't see it, it's quite small, but it is SSL. Now, why would that be SSL? All we're doing is just dragging back images. Isn't that going to slow it down and stuff like that? Maybe. The reason it's SSL is because of the applications that run on the iPhone or whatever that interact with this do so using an authorization mechanism called OAuth. So it has to be SSL. Another example, this is me not signed in, so an anonymous user. I've gone to Flickr, I've gone to my set of images, that's SSL. Facebook, obviously, is something you have to log on to, but that's SSL as well when we're past the authorization stage of things, just for viewing images. And this is, because of the integration of applications, it's not just a question of people using a web browser on a desktop anymore, drives the need to do this. And when somebody like Google introduces this, it really freaks a lot of companies out because that's a big change. It breaks a lot of simple things. Lots of companies still use proxy servers for internet access. This can have pretty dramatic impact, but it is the right thing to be doing. So when SharePoint 2013 shipped, Microsoft came out with a bundle of quite strange, but also quite good recommendations. You should deploy a single web application. You should always use SSL, so on. Those were too aggressive recommendations. In other words, they weren't recognizing the practical reality in the field of how customers deploy. And furthermore, they didn't really articulate the reason why it was a recommendation. They'd just say, we recommend you use SSL, full stop. They didn't say why. Now, the reason why is because of a thing called OAuth. Basically, every new feature aspect of SharePoint from a functionality point of view that was introduced in SharePoint 2013 relies 100% on OAuth for application authorization, or uses something that's very similar to OAuth for application authorization. So whether it's the app's infrastructure to support the cloud app model, whether it's interaction with project server, whether it's interaction with Office web apps, all of these things use this approach to application authorization. We also use it when we're doing a server-to-server trust. Anybody here doing services federation across multiple farms? Okay, I have sympathy for you guys, but yeah, that's an example of where you're doing, your trust is done via certificate exchange, and the network traffic is SSL as well. We also need it anytime we do an Office 365 deployment using federated identity. That's, again, a server-to-server trust. We use it for hybrid. We use it for talking to, if we're using work management, we're using that to speak to Exchange. Strong recommendation here. Think about how you're going to take that out in the near future. But the reality is that server trust is done via certificate exchange. Now, when OAuth 2 was being developed, all of the vendors got involved and wanted a way to enable these scenarios, right? People like IBM and Microsoft and Oracle are in the business of selling what's new. Every time they bring out a new version of a product, they've got to have a reason to upgrade, right? There's got to be something cool in it that makes it worth paying the money for. And so all of those organizations pressured the people working on OAuth to basically lose all of the work that was done in the protocol around confidentiality and integrity. There is no signatures or cryptography in this protocol whatsoever. Okay? So basically, it's like, whoa, we're not going to care about that. If we just make it SSL, all our problems go away. Okay? Now, the quote at the bottom of the slide here is by the primary author of OAuth 2, a very controversial character. And he's got a very clear opinion on whether he thinks OAuth 2 is any good or not, right? He doesn't like it. And he's right. But the problem here is we can't influence it, okay? SharePoint and many other products have made the decision to use this because of its utility value. It allows us to do things like Office web apps, right? Now, to be clear, Office web apps doesn't use OAuth. It uses a proprietary Microsoft version of OAuth, which is slightly different to allow things like rights management. But we can't, this is probably going to come up in customer discussions, but SharePoint's already made this decision. And it's not just the things that we've currently got. If we look forward at what's coming with the products, whether it be SharePoint or anything else from Microsoft Office, they all rely on this. Okay? Everything relies on this moving forward. We also need to think about non-OAuth scenarios. So if we forget about OAuth and we're just using SharePoint as a document management system or collaboration platform, we think about the value of our data there. We should probably be doing it over SSL anyway. Also the trust exchange that we've spoken about. And fundamentally, being comfortable with the SSL configuration is a very valuable skill to have in the marketplace right now, because most people aren't, and that's the harsh reality. Mainly because SharePoint makes it difficult. It's always been an area where, say, oh, it's somebody else's problem, or it's outsourced to somebody else, that runs the certificate authority, there's purchasing involved, and all the rest of it. But everything we do with the product needs comfortability with this configuration, especially around renewal processes and so on. So we need to be using it, as I've mentioned before. For apps, we have a bit of a hack to enable apps, okay? Because we need to have independent URLs for each host for the application, we need something called a wildcard certificate or a SAN certificate. Now that can be a bit of a problem because a lot of companies don't like wildcard certificates, and for good reasons, right? A certificate is one of the things that it does is it guarantees the identity of a principal. Okay, well, a wildcard certificate immediately debunks that and says, well, I'm guaranteeing a whole bunch of principles. But it is how it has to work, mainly because of just a simple desire to build an infrastructure that can scale. Not to scale for on-premises, but to scale for the cloud. And we have the same infrastructure in the on-premises version of the product. But it wasn't designed for on-premises. This whole idea of having a dummy web application that's listening on with no host headers in order to support all of these app URLs is just a workaround. Okay? And it's a clever workaround, but it is a workaround. It's not something that you would design as a security subsystem. Now, you can actually do it without a wildcard certificate, but every time a user adds an app into your environment, somebody's going to have to go and create a certificate and install it before that app works. So that's kind of ridiculous. Bear in mind, we can do multiple host headers with SSL certificates using a feature of the web server called server name identification. The problem with this is, it sounds great, but it doesn't work with Outlook, and it doesn't work with OneNote. So if only you care about a web browser client running on a desktop, you're golden with this feature. But the feature isn't widely tested or implemented in most of the client applications. So if you want to use OneNote directly against SharePoint, or you want to use the iPad applications, you can't use this capability. Okay, so it's something to, just because it's possible doesn't mean it's going to kind of support the wide focus of features that we need to. So it's not just something that's done on the web server, it's done in the client as well. And things like Outlook and OneNote don't understand this protocol addition at present, and probably won't for quite some time. So a little bit on the different types of certificates. We've already spoken about wildcard certs. There's another big limitation of these guys in so much as you can't really control the namespace of URLs that you want. You can see the examples on the slide here of what's covered, but it doesn't cover the hr.pub.woodgrove bank address. So that really drives us towards a thing called a subject alternative name certificate. This has got to be fundamentally considered the recommended type of certificate you use. It allows ultimate flexibility in URL namespaces. We can add and remove certificate names quite easily. The only real thing to watch out for here is, these certificate vendors that sell public certificates, they like selling certificates at $150 a pop, even though it takes 5 seconds to create it. So what they might do is limit the number of URLs you can have in the SAN certificate to maybe 5 or 10. And if you want 20, you have to pay a little bit more because that's a premium certificate. Okay? That's a total scam, but it's one that they can get away with. So many of the public CAs have limits on the number of URLs you can have in a SAN certificate. That's a pretty important planning consideration, especially with a hybrid or Office 365 deployment, because just out of the box, to get all of the pieces working with identity federation and exchange and link, you need 5 names straight off the bat. That's without any SharePoint apps at all. So just an input, if you are using public certificates, that's a good planning and cost consideration. Okay, I'm going to show a few things here. I can't show too much, mainly for time, and I don't want to run over massively, as usual. So I've got a very simple environment here set up on this machine. We've just got SharePoint running on a couple of boxes. It's gone to sleep, hang on a second. Nothing particularly interesting in this environment. It's a deliberately simple configuration. Got a couple of web apps here, one that's hosting the intranet, and one that's hosting the My Sites, or what's now called OneDrive. And they're both configured using SSL. And just to do this, I have to perform a workaround in the script that I've used to build this environment, because SharePoint thinks you can only have one SSL web app, basically, using the default creation logic. And of course, there isn't a certificate for either of these things at present. This is just the SharePoint configuration. If I actually try and go to any of these things, it's not going to work. or it shouldn't work. So wait for the app pull to come up before it gives me an access denied error. But as you know, the whole point of sort of the next step in terms of applying that certificate is multiple options. I mean, a lot of you will know IIS. We can go in and basically do a certificate request from here, just like we would if it was some public access website. Oh, sorry, it's a bit small. I can come in down here, create a domain certificate, et cetera, and that works. There's nothing wrong with that. But then I've got my certificate on this one machine. That's not a good idea because we're going to have more than one machine. We need to think about how we're going to manage certificates across the estate. And so generally, I wouldn't use this kind of tooling because it adds more complexity to our operation. We're better off using the certificate console, the snap-in, and using our domain CA that way. Other things to note is IIS has got a thing called the shared configuration for certificates. It uses a UNC path. Guess what? That's not supported with SharePoint 2013. Okay, so it sounds great, and it does work actually 100% fine. There's no problems with it, but it's not a tested configuration. So those kind of things we need to be cautious of. In the same way that the product isn't really dovetailed with IIS, also the other improvements to IIS can't be sort of leveraged. So generally, I would do the certificates via the certificate snap-in on a machine, or via, or via PowerShell scripts, because all of the certificate generation, renewal, etc., management can be done by PowerShell. It's got nothing to do with SharePoint. It's entirely Windows Server actions. So I'm just going to add that snap in here. Apologies for the slowness of the demo. I don't actually have a mouse here, so I'm using the trackpad. Nope, that's the wrong one. And I'm going to choose the computer account. And then I can go ahead and load this up and basically go get, oops, going to the right place. That's interesting. Can't find my enroll. That's very interesting. You can see the one that I already have created there. Why is that not showing up? Anybody got any hints and tips? Yep. But I should be able to enroll from this machine, right? Yes. Oops, I don't do that. Just because I'm in the wrong place. Yeah. And, you know, I've got the similar policy enrollment that I see in IIS, but I have much more flexibility. But you'll note here that I don't have anything configured. And the reason for this is, in the default configuration, the computer account of the machine that I'm on, FabSP1, does not have permissions on the certificate authority to enroll a web server certificate. And that's like hidden in the depths of certificate management, which generally runs on a domain controller in most cases. Probably shouldn't, but you know. So I'm going to wait for the properties to load up here. I don't really understand why my egg timer is here. Oh, here we go. And so for these are the types of certificates that I have as my web server. And I go ahead and apply permissions to this guy to allow the web servers in the environment to enroll. So given those kind of things, right, the SharePoint side of it is rather nasty, the IIS side of it is rather nasty, this doesn't work too great. The best way to deal with this is to script up the enrollment and creation of the certificates and then the deployment of them to the machines in the environment. Because we can do all of that, in a 10 or 15 line PowerShell script that's got nothing to do with SharePoint, gets them into the right places on the machine, and then all we need to do is configure the bindings in IIS to use the correct certificate. That also means it's a lot easier in DR scenario if we need to rebuild a web server and add it into the farm to apply the same configuration there. It also makes it easier to add new machines into the farm if we need to for scaling purposes and so on. We'll be posting on Friday, no that's not right, on Thursday we'll be posting a bunch of sample scripts for the end-to-end management of these certificates. It's not complex stuff, but the syntax for navigating the hierarchy of storage of a CA is a little bit wacky. If you're not familiar with it, it can really take quite a long time to get your head around it, especially when you're using fully qualified names for things. That would be another recommendation, right? No matter how you're deploying, and hopefully this is the case for most of you. Sorry, let me go back over here. Get rid of all this. Come back over here. When I create my web applications, I'm not thinking about alternate access mappings. That's a dreadful hack. You want to stay away from those as much as possible. We're creating this with the name that we're going to access it, regardless of where our user is. And because we then have that fully qualified name, we can use a single variable in all of our scripting to reference the common name of the certificate, the web application, the site collection, and all of our kind of quota and other non-SSL type operations. That really should be how we create web applications. This isn't an argument from me to say we should be using host name site collections, right? Because that is not necessarily a practical recommendation for on-premises deployments. But if we're using host-based sites, then this would be how to go about it in terms of the initial address. Because if I do it like this, I don't care about alternate access mappings. They're just not part of the equation at all. Okie doke. Let's flip back to the slides, if I can. So some recommendations, slides are the wrong way around. They're not like strong recommendations, it's just kind of more general guidance. If you're working with Office 365, you really need to be using either a domain certificate or ideally a publicly issued SSL certificate. We need a minimum of one, right? We can do everything with one SAN certificate. We could do everything with one wildcard as well, but that's a different consideration, right? Microsoft make a recommendation that you use a different DNS address for apps versus your SharePoint applications. And if you do that, you are implementing some risk mitigation for cross-site scripting, okay? That's 100% complete rubbish, okay? There is no good reason to do that. Microsoft, on their Office 365, they don't do it, okay, because they're implementing better approaches to deal with cross-site scripting as part of the network edge from their perspective. You don't try and use self-signed certificates for this stuff unless you're just kind of playing around with it in a lab and trying to get your head around, identity federation and hybrid configuration. Basically use public certificates here, which is interesting, isn't it? Because there's a cost. It might be a small cost, a couple $100, a couple £100, whatever, but it's still money that needs to be spent, and you need that working renewal process. We've seen this with many customers. It's one of the little hidden things that aren't really promoted. When you deploy identity federation with Office 365, you have to deploy more infrastructure on premises to make that work, even though you're going to the cloud. This is another example of that. Nothing we can do about it. Remember, we don't control this service, and it's quite a simple process as long as you could deal with that renewal. For on-premises, if you're anybody doing internet-facing sites with SharePoint 2013, a few of you, okay, so from that perspective, it really needs to be a public certificate because you don't know who's coming to the site, you don't have any control of the device. It might be, an internet cafe in Africa somewhere that hasn't had it's still running IE6 or something. You've got no idea what certificates CAs are trusted on those clients. So it's fairly straightforward. For kind of the internal facing thing, the best way to do it is to use a domain certificate authority. There's a lot of nervousness about this because that's more deployment, something that we have to build and manage, but it's very easy. It's so much easier to do this, and it gives you flexibility and independence from somebody else. You don't want to just deploy a CA for SharePoint. There are other considerations there in terms of protecting, especially the root certificate that you use to base your CA on. But it will make everything so much easier going forward. And remember, we're talking about SharePoint now, but it will be the same types of approaches for all of the other application services that are coming down the line. Development environments, I don't really agree with the recommendation, but it's okay to use self-signed. I try not to. When I'm working in development environments, I want the environment to match as closely as possible what the intended production is going to be so that I don't hit a possible issue. Okay, it's a bit like back in the day when the web config would have the URL of the site in, the types of things that developers used to do, the SQL username and password, right, in the web config. You've got to try and avoid those kind of things. And the reality is, unless you're a one-man band, you're going to have more than one person and more than one environment, So by having a domain CA, you can make it so much easier to manage the overall development kind of life cycle in terms of the infrastructure they need without having to worry about self-signed certificates that don't cross machine boundaries. Yeah, everything as far as SharePoint configuration is concerned is external. We've already been through this in terms of the PowerShell recommendation, but this is basically the points of configuration. This one, again, I try and stay away from, but there's still a lot of people that use the AAMs. Lots of reasons like legacy as to why those were necessary in the past, especially if you're using a reverse proxy. Just watch out for things like I mentioned that the shared certificate management is unsupported. Watch out for the problems with SNI with the client applications. But it's fairly simple stuff. What's important is to have a rinse and repeat process for it, which is why the PowerShell approach is so appealing. Okie doke, so that's, one more thing. This is actually really important. One of the biggest problems we have in this space is things like Workflow Manager. Okay, configuring Workflow Manager and SharePoint to talk to each other. It's relatively simple, but there's some things that just don't work. And we get lots of questions in this area. Things like, well, can I do SSL offloading? Can I terminate SSL and put it onto an external device? Well, the answer to that is, well, you can, but think about why we're doing SSL in the first place, right? It's to protect that authorization flow. So if you then terminate SSL on some other box, you aren't protecting that bearer token over the wire anymore. And the network isn't trusted, remember. So there's a lot of scenarios like that, offloading, acceleration, key management. These are all scenarios that Microsoft, even if they put the entire company onto testing SharePoint, wouldn't be able to test all of the things that we might want to do in terms of our deployment. So the only way to fix that is to feed it back to the vendor, and we've been very successful with this. Right? Anytime we hit one of these, like we did with the Workflow Manager and wildcards for termination, that now is possible. That's been fixed. But the only way, it's not going to happen on its own. It's up to us to basically feed back to Microsoft our scenarios and argue the case. And I can help with that if you are struggling with getting the feedback to the right people. Just email me and we can move it forward. Bear in mind that things like SSL acceleration are actually pretty pointless these days. There used to be an argument that if you're doing the handshake, the initial handshake of SSL was expensive, and therefore you would offload that onto external hardware so that it wasn't hammering your web server. Well, that was valid when we had Pentiums, right? Pentium 75s running websites. For the type of servers that are running websites today, it's completely pointless. And it doesn't matter what the key length is. We double the key length to 2048, 4096. It's not going to have that much of an impact. The only benefit of external devices in that kind of area is the management of the certificates themselves. Okay? It makes it easier to manage and protect the certificates. through using a lockbox. But we're still going to have to deploy those certificates on all our machines in the environment anyway, because we're not using it for a client server, we're using it for server to server. So the certificates must be on the machines as well. So yeah, basically SSL is the protocol that allows the cloud to do anything because of this approach chosen for the applications. So all our web apps should be using it, even if we're just like an on-premises intranet, doing collaboration. It's not as easy as it should be, and it's not going to get easier, right? The next version of SharePoint is not going to make this a breeze. So, the points here all remain valid with what's coming down the line. The more comfortable you are with this configuration, the more valuable you are, and the quicker it will be to configure scenarios, the types of scenarios that we've seen. Even just something like high availability, if you're using high availability groups in SQL Server, you want that to be SSL, right? It's a bit like configuring Kerberos authentication for the SharePoint to SQL Server traffic. How many people do SQL Server over SSL? Yeah, quite a lot of people do, but many people don't, right? So that, the syntax and being comfortable with the PowerShell and the UI configuration for this is very important and becoming more so. It's not going to get any less important. And also bear in mind that we do need to think, why are we doing this, right? That's the SSL termination question again, right? We're protecting the application authorization mechanism here. So that means it's point-to-point encryption. So we can't just offload these things onto some magic box somewhere that costs $20,000 and you have to pay somebody a yearly support fee for, because the certificate needs to be at every point regardless. At some point in the future, the industry might get its act together and give us HTTP v2, right? And it might be a suitable protocol for these types of things that make this easier. But I wouldn't hold our breath, right? Because we've been asking for it for 15 years already, and there's no sign of it yet. So the fundamentals that underpin why we're doing or making the choice to use SSL need to be right at the forefront, because if we took that out, and we just put our faith in some magic box, we're no longer mitigating the key risk that means this is important in the first place. So with that, we're just about out of time.